The four minds of General Vreth did not sleep at the same time. They never had. In 200 years of continuous warfare across the breadth of the Kaelthari Dominion, across 17 star systems and 43 declared conflicts and 9 wars that had no official declaration but killed more beings than the declared ones combined, the four minds had learned to stagger themselves, 2 resting while 2 kept watch, cycling through rest and wakefulness the way some organisms cycle through breathing. It was not something Vreth had trained herself to do. It was something she had simply become. The mind she named Keth, the one that processed tactical geometry and spatial logic, was the one that first understood what the senses were showing her when the ruptures began to appear. The mind she named Sova, which carried her emotional memory and the long archives of everything she had ever felt about war, went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet in decades. The mind she named Drell, which handled language and communication and the endless subtleties of diplomatic context that any military commander needed to understand even if she never used them directly, began composing 17 simultaneous threat assessments in 17 different linguistic frameworks. And the fourth mind, the one she had never given a name because it did not think in ways that names could capture, the one that existed in the space between the other 3 and wove their separate streams into something unified and coherent, simply watched. She was standing in the command sphere of the unbroken premise, a vessel so large that the Kaelthari who served aboard it often went weeks without seeing its outer hull from the inside. The command sphere itself was a globe of transparent material 200 meters in diameter, suspended at the ship's geometric center by 17 structural columns that contained the primary power conduits and data arteries of the vessel. The sphere could rotate on any axis. It could tilt. It could, in an emergency that Vreth had never needed to invoke in 2 centuries of command, detach entirely and operate as an independent craft for up to 30 standard cycles. All around the transparent walls, space was displayed in its true darkness, unfiltered, the stars sharp and cold and indifferent. Except now, in 6 places that Vreth could see from where she stood on her 6 limbs in the center of the sphere, the stars were not indifferent. They were interrupted. The ruptures had appeared 11 days ago. The first one had opened 40 light minutes from the Dominion's secondary transit hub at Vesserol, and the automated systems had immediately flagged it as an anomaly requiring senior review, which meant the data had spent 9 days traveling up through the Dominion command hierarchy before anyone who mattered had seen it. By the time the data reached someone who mattered, 3 more ruptures had appeared, and by the time Vreth had been summoned from a frontier engagement she was in the middle of resolving, 6 were confirmed, with sensors suggesting for more in the outer reaches of the system. They were perfectly circular. That was the first thing that Keth processed and found disturbing. Natural phenomena did not make perfect circles. The universe had profound indifference to geometric perfection. Even the most regular structures in nature carried the slight asymmetries of emergence, of matter behaving statistically rather than precisely. These circles were precise. Each one was exactly 412 meters in diameter. Not approximately, not within a margin of measurement error. Exactly, as if the measurement and the thing measured were the same event. And they were doors. That was the second thing, and it took Keth 2 full days to admit it, because the mind that processed tactical geometry had a professional resistance to conclusions that broke the framework she worked within. But when she finally admitted it, the word arrived with a weight of certainty: doors. The other side was visible. You could look through. You could see a different arrangement of stars, a different sky, a universe that was and was not the same as this one. And things were coming through. Not aggressively. That was the part that Sova kept returning to, troubled, cycling through it with the obsessive repetition that mind used when something emotional demanded processing. The things that came through the doors did not come aggressively. They did not come in military formation. They did not come with weapons deployed or shields raised or any of the postures that 200 years of warfare had taught Vreth to read as instantly as she read her own pulse. They came the way that refugees came. The Kaelthari Dominion was 600 years old and occupied 11 star systems linked by a transit network that its founders had spent the first 200 years of the Dominion's existence constructing and the subsequent 400 years arguing about who owned it. The Kaelthari themselves were told by the standards of the universe's known civilizations, bilateral in their underlying symmetry but elaborated beyond bilateral simplicity into something more complex. 6 limbs arranged in 2 rows of 3 down a central torso, the upper limb specialized for fine manipulation, the middle for heavy work and display, the lower for locomotion. Their skin expressed biochemical state in patterns of color and luminescence that were as communicatively rich as any spoken language. When Vreth was in deep tactical thought, which was most of the time, her skin cycled through low blues and deep greens in patterns that the Kaelthari officers who served under her had learned to read the way others read barometric pressure before a storm. Her 4 minds were not unusual for her species. All Kaelthari had multiple minds. The standard was 2, and 2 minds was considered by most of the universe's other civilizations to be already disorienting enough. 4 minds was rare. 6 had been recorded twice in Kaelthari history. 8 was theoretical. Vreth had 4, and the 4 were not simply more thinking power ranged in parallel. They were qualitatively different from each other, specialized in ways that 2-minded Kaelthari found difficult to conceptualize. When Vreth thought about a military problem, she was not thinking about it 4 times. She was thinking about it in 4 fundamentally different ways simultaneously, and the unnamed 4th mind was weaving the 4 streams into a synthesis that transcended what any of the 4 could have reached alone. This was why she had never lost a war. This was also, she reflected now, standing in the command sphere watching the ruptures drift slowly in the gravitational field of the system star, while the situation she was now facing felt like walking into a room she did not have sensory organs to perceive. The Dominion Council had given her unified command of the Combined Galactic Defense Response 6 days ago. The Council meeting had been contentious in the way all Dominion Council meetings were contentious, which was to say that it had involved 17 competing factions, 39 separate agenda items, of which 22 were proxies to the actual agenda items that no one would admit were on the agenda, and approximately 400 minutes of procedural theater before the actual decision was made in the last 12 minutes by exhausted beings who simply wanted to be finished. But the decision was the right one, and Vreth had accepted the command with a quiet steadiness that her officers recognized as a sign that she had already begun the war. The difficulty was that she was not certain this was a war. The first Vael that anyone managed to communicate with appeared through one of the ruptures on the 23rd day, which was 12 days into Vreth's unified command and 61 days after the first rupture had opened. It did not walk through. It did not fly through. It moved through the way light moves through a window, present on one side, then present on the other, the transition too smooth to mark a moment of crossing. Vreth had stationed observation platforms at all confirmed ruptures, with standing orders not to fire unless fired upon and to record everything. The platform crew near the 4th rupture, a 3-being team from the Kaelthari's allied species of Morith, had been rotating through 12-hour observation cycles for 9 days with nothing to observe but the steady, unchanging circle of not this universe visible through the aperture. Then the Vael came through, and the Morith observer named Tovulshan, who had been eating a meal packet when the sensors chimed, set down the meal packet and watched with all 4 of her eyes and did not touch her weapons, and later told Vreth that in the moment she had not understood what she was looking at. The Vael was not visible in any ordinary sense. It did not have a body. What Tovulshan's eyes registered was a distortion, a place where the light behaved differently, where the photons that should have traveled in straight lines curved slightly around a region of organized complexity that was not matter, but which interacted with matter's environment the way matter does. The sensors that measured electromagnetic fields showed a dense, structured pattern where the Vael was present. The sensors that measured gravitational influence showed a very slight, very localized perturbation. The thermal sensors showed nothing. The chemical sensors showed nothing. The radiation sensors showed a faint emission in a spectrum that the platform's database categorized as unclassified. It hovered in the space between the rupture and the observation platform. It did not approach. It did not retreat. Tovulshan, acting on instinct and training in a quality that Vreth would later tell the Dominion Council was simply good judgment, said aloud into the platform's general broadcast system, in the 7 languages she knew, and then in the free trade pigeons' use of the Dominion's outer edges, the most basic phrase in the diplomatic lexicon of every known civilization: "We see you." The Vael did not respond in language. What it did was alter the electromagnetic emission pattern. The sensors recorded a shift, a structuring of what had been a formless faint radiation into something organized. The platform's analytical systems flagged it as possibly intentional. The data were transmitted instantly to Vreth's command sphere, where Drell, the mind that lived in language, received it and began working. Drell worked on the signal for 19 days. In those 19 days, 12 more Vael came through various ruptures. They behaved identically to the first. They appeared. They hovered. They did not approach. They did not retreat, and they emitted structured electromagnetic signals that were clearly intentional and clearly communicative and utterly, profoundly resistant to decipherment. The problem, Drell kept explaining to the other three minds, was not vocabulary. It was not even grammar, though the grammar was genuinely strange. The problem was ontological. Every communication system Drell had ever worked with, whether the click-pressure language of the deep ocean Kethnav or the chromatic chemical language of the Vreth hive minds or the quantum state signaling of the Pelari entities who lived inside stellar coronas, every system presupposed certain things about the nature of the beings communicating. It presupposed location. It presupposed duration. It presupposed the existence of a self that persisted through time and had experiences that accumulated. Even the most alien communication systems Drell had encountered presupposed that the communicating entity was somewhere, that it existed in some medium, that it had a relationship to its environment which could be described in terms of position and interaction. The Vael signals presupposed none of these things. Not that they contradicted them, not that they described a different kind of position or duration. They simply did not include these concepts, the way a description of color does not include the concept of temperature, not because color and temperature contradict each other, but because they are orthogonal. They occupy different dimensions of description, and a language built only for color would not merely fail to describe temperature, but would fail to have a space in which temperature could be described. Vreth sat with this problem across 19 days. All four minds engaged with it simultaneously, and arrived at a conclusion that she brought to the Dominion Council with the flat certainty that had characterized her military briefings for 2 centuries. "We cannot communicate with them using any framework we currently possess," she said. "Not because they are unintelligent, not because they are unwilling, but because the gap between what we understand existence to be and what they understand existence to be is wider than any gap this Dominion or any civilization known to this Dominion has previously encountered. Our communication attempts thus far have been the equivalent of trying to describe solid geometry to an entity that exists in 2 dimensions. The concepts do not fail to translate. They fail to have meaning." The council, predictably, asked what she intended to do about it. Vreth said, "Learn." What Vreth needed in order to learn was someone who had spent their life thinking about the nature of existence in ways that military doctrine did not require. She summoned 3 of them. The first was a Kaelthari theorist named Oswald, who had spent 60 years studying the mathematical structures underlying consciousness and had published works so abstract that fewer than 200 beings in the Dominion had read it and fewer than 30 claimed to understand it. Oswald arrived on the unbroken premise in a state of barely contained excitement that made their skin cycle through yellows and sharp reds, which in Kaelthari biochemical language indicated something between intellectual arousal and territorial alarm. Vreth found Oswald's company exhausting and indispensable in equal measure. The second was a Morith named Vael, who was not a scientist but a practitioner of a Morith philosophical tradition so old that the Morith themselves could not trace its origins, a tradition concerned with what the Morith called the space between existing things, which in practice meant a contemplative discipline aimed at understanding relationship and process rather than substance and object. Vael was 400 years old, which for the Morith represented extreme age, and moved with the slow precision of being for whom every gesture had become fully intentional over centuries of practice. Vreth had met Vael once before, briefly, at a diplomatic function she had attended for military strategic reasons, and departed from as quickly as protocol allowed. She had remembered Vael, which she noted was unusual. She generally did not remember beings she met briefly at diplomatic functions. The third was a being of a species called the Devarath, a species that the Dominion had made war on 80 years ago and then made peace with 50 years ago and had been cautiously cooperating with for the 30 years since. The Devarath were small, dense-bodied, hexapodal beings whose nervous systems were so intricately distributed throughout their bodies that they had no centralized brain. Their cognition emerged from the interaction of approximately 40 semi-autonomous neural clusters, which the Devarath did not experience as a fragmented self but as a deeply democratic one. Every decision the Devarath made was, at the neurological level, a consensus. The Devarath that Vreth summoned was named Icheth-7, a designation that indicated it was a 7th recorded member of the Icheth neural lineage, a lineage distinguished by a particular configuration of the 40 clusters that produced something resembling what other species called intuition, but which the Devarath described more precisely as a rapid precognitive synthesis of distributed information. Icheth-7 looked at Vreth's sensor data on the Vael for 4 days without speaking. Then it said, in the shared trade language that the Dominion and the Vreth use in formal contexts. They are not beings who exist in places. They are beings who exist in relationships. Oswald immediately began arguing. Vael said nothing but made a very small gesture with one limb that Vreth, despite being neither old nor Morith, somehow read correctly as affirmation. The theory that HS7 proposed, and that Oswald spent the next 3 weeks attacking from every analytical angle before reluctantly agreeing was consistent with the data, was this. The Vael did not have individual existence in the sense that any materially embodied being did. They were organized fields of energy, yes, but the organization was not static. It was dynamic, relational, maintained through constant interaction with the energy fields of their environment. A Vael entity was not a thing that moved through space. It was a process that occurred across space. The boundary between one Vael and another was not a sharp line but a gradient of organizational influence, a zone of increasing or decreasing coherence. The self of a Vael, if the word applied at all, was more like a persistent pattern in a flowing medium than like a body moving through an environment. This explained why their language presupposed no fixed location. For the Vael, location was not a property of the self but an artifact of the self's current pattern of interaction with its environment. It changed continuously and was not the kind of thing one would think to specify in communication, for the same reason that a being who breathed would not typically specify in each sentence that it was currently breathing. It also explained, in a way that made Sova go quiet and stay quiet for 2 days, what the Vael were doing. When they came through the ruptures and hovered, apparently doing nothing, they were not waiting. They were not being cautious. They were extending themselves through this universe's space, tasting it, feeling its energy fields, its radiation patterns, its gravitational structures, the electromagnetic signatures of every star and planet and ship and being in sensor range. They were learning the universe the way an organism learns a new medium, not by observing from outside but by becoming continuous with it, by letting its properties enter the field of their own organized complexity and become part of their ongoing pattern. They were, each S7 said, in their own way introducing themselves. And the 12 Vael who had come through in those 19 days had, in the Vael's own framework, already communicated everything essential about themselves. The structured electromagnetic signals were not attempts at language in the sense of symbolic communication. They were direct expressions of the Vael's organizational pattern, something closer to showing than telling, the equivalent of a being who could not speak simply allowing itself to be seen. "They've been telling us who they are," Vael said, very quietly, from the corner where they sat in the posture that Morith used for sustained contemplation. "And we've been trying to decode the information, as if it were encoded." Vreth's 4 minds processed this simultaneously. Keth noted that it changed the threat assessment significantly. Sova felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and had no name she had ever found for it in 200 years of war. Drell began revising every communication protocol from the ground up, and the unnamed 4th mind did something it had never done before in Vreth's experience of herself. It stopped weaving the other 3 into synthesis and simply held the space where synthesis was absent, sitting with a not knowing the way the Mora tradition Vael practice had a word for and the Kaelthari tradition did not. On the 4th to 7th day of Vreth's unified command, she authorized the first genuine attempt at contact, designed by the 3 consultants working together over 17 continuous work cycles, argued over and refined and argued over again, until even Oswald admitted that further refinement without feedback from the Vael was pointless. The attempt involved no language, no signal, no technology. It involved a single Kaelthari officer, a young being named Tess, who had been selected for a quality that the selection committee had struggled to name and finally described as comfort with not knowing, walking to a distance of approximately 50 meters from the Vael entity near the 4th rupture, and simply being present there. Not observing, not measuring, not waiting for a response. Being present, with all the biological electromagnetic field of a Kaelthari body's natural processes, the bioelectric signals of neural activity, the faint magnetic fields of metabolic chemistry, the thermal radiation of a warm body, the quantum coherence effects and synaptic processes of the 400-plus neural connections that a Kaelthari maintained in wakeful consciousness. A living being, present in the Vael's vicinity, offering itself to be known not as a source of information but as a field event, a structured complexity of organized matter emitting organized energy in patterns that were the patterns of life itself. The Vael, after 6 minutes and 19 seconds of stillness so complete that Tess later said she had become uncertain whether it was still there, moved toward her. Not toward her body, into the space that her body occupied. And Tess felt, and reported with careful precision and some difficulty with vocabulary, that she felt known, that something in her own electromagnetic field had been read, not invasively, not painfully, but completely, the way a being with highly sensitive senses might know the emotional state of another being simply by standing near them. And then she felt the Vael in her own field, a slight, structured perturbation, an addition of organized complexity to the electromagnetic environment of her own body, gentle enough that her body's own systems did not register it as intrusion, but present enough that her brain registered it as presence. They stood this way for 41 minutes. When Vreth reviewed the sensor data afterward, she noted that over those 41 minutes, the electromagnetic emission pattern of the Vael had gradually shifted until it contained elements that corresponded to Tessa's own bioelectric signature patterns. The Vael was not mimicking her. It was not copying her. It was incorporating her, adding her organizational patterns into its own ongoing process, the way a river incorporates a tributary, changed by the addition, carrying both forward. This was, each S7 said when it saw the data, the Vael's equivalent of learning someone's name. This was also, Vreth's Keth mind immediately noted, the source of every misunderstanding that had nearly caused this situation to become a war. The other civilizations had not been as restrained as the Kaelthari Defense Forces. In the outer regions of the galaxy, in star systems where the Dominion's unified command was a recent imposition that local governments had accepted with varying degrees of reluctance, the Vael's method of introduction had been met with weapons. Not successfully. The Vael entities that had been fired upon had simply ceased to interact with the weapon's effects. The organized field moved through space in ways that matter-based projectiles and directed energy weapons could not easily follow, because the Vael was not in any one place at any moment the way a material target was in a place. You could not shoot at a process. You could not target a relationship. But the weapon's fire had not gone unfelt. The Vael had not been harmed by it in any physical sense. They had been, as well as Drell and each S7 and Vael could determine from the subsequent change in behavior of Vael entities near those sites, confused. Then something that might have been distressed. Then something that took another week to identify. And when Vael finally named it, the naming landed in the command sphere like a weight. Grief, Vael said. They are expressing something analogous to grief. Vreth asked for clarification. Vael said, when they approach beings with the intention of introduction, with the intention of making contact and being known, and those beings responded by attempting destruction, the Vael experienced something equivalent to what any being would experience when genuine approach is met with violence. Not physical pain, ontological pain. The pain of discovering that the universe you are migrating to does not recognize you as a being worth greeting. Sova, the mind that carried Vreth's emotional memory, knew this pain by a different name. It had a Kaelthari word, a very old one, used by the military tradition to describe a specific kind of damage done to warriors who had fought with honor and been answered with atrocity. The word meant approximately the wound that comes not from violence itself but from the discovery that the other side did not consider you worth the dignity of real opposition. Vreth sat with this for a long time. Then she opened a channel to all unified command forces and transmitted a single order: no weapons. No weapons for any reason. The order was to be treated as the highest priority directive in the unified command structure, superseding all previous engagement rules, effective immediately and until further notice. Any commander who violated it would answer to her personally. There were 17 formal objections filed within the hour. She acknowledged all 17 and did not change the order. Meanwhile, the migration was continuing. Vreth had understood from the beginning that the military framing of the situation was inadequate, but she had not yet understood the scale of inadequacy until Oswald presented her with an analysis of the rupture frequency and the rate at which Vael entities were coming through. The rate was not constant. It was accelerating. In the first month, 12 Vael entities had come through confirmed ruptures. In the second month, it was 6 to 7. The current rate, Oswald projected, would produce approximately 3,000 Vael entities in the fourth month, and the mathematical model Oswald had developed, based on the assumption that the Vael were managing a population migration rather than a military incursion, suggested a total Vael population in the home universe of somewhere between 40 billion and 400 billion entities. The variance in that estimate was enormous, because they did not yet understand enough about the Vael to know how to count them. How do you count a population of beings for whom the individual is a matter of degree rather than a discrete category? The universe that the Vael were migrating from was dying. Drell had assembled enough communication with the Vael entities present in this universe to establish that much, in rough outline, through the painstaking process of bioelectric field interaction that Tess had pioneered. The Vael's home universe was suffering a collapse of its physical constants. Not all constants. Not uniformly. But the constants that govern behavior of energy fields at quantum scales were degrading, and for beings whose existence was itself an energy field phenomenon, this was existential. Their universe was becoming unable to support them. The stars were burning irregularly. The quantum vacuum was destabilizing. The Vael had known this was coming for 300 years, and they had spent those 300 years finding the ruptures, engineering the doors, and planning the migration. They had chosen this universe because its physical constants were not only stable but matched the Vael's own requirements precisely. The same physical laws that allowed matter-based life to exist in this universe also allowed the Vael to exist in it, in a way that had not been the case in several other adjacent universes the Vael had investigated. This universe was, from the Vael perspective, home. Not a home they had been born into, but a home they had identified through 3 centuries of searching as a one place in the multiverse where they could continue to exist. And there were 40 billion to 400 billion of them. The combined population of every species in the Kaelthari Dominion and its allied civilizations was approximately 900 billion. Even at the low estimate, the Vael migration would increase the galaxy's effective population by more than 4%. At the high estimate, nearly half. But population numbers, Vreth increasingly understood, were not the right frame for thinking about what the Vael's presence would mean, because the Vael did not occupy space the way material beings did. They did not need planets. They did not need atmosphere. They did not need food or water or any of the resources that material civilizations competed for. What they needed was the electromagnetic environment of the universe itself, the fields, the radiation, the quantum states of matter as it existed in this universe's fabric. They needed the universe to exist as a physical environment, not any particular part of it. All of it, more or less, as an ambient medium. And the universe was, in that sense, very large, and they were not asking to use any specific part of it. But there was a problem, and the problem was what sharing meant. The first incident happened in the Vesserol system, 4 to 9 days into Vreth's command. 18 days after the no-weapons order. A Kaelthari civilian transport carrying 912 passengers and crew was making a routine transit when a Vael entity moved through its hull. Not through the metal of the hull, through the space that the hull and the people inside it occupied. The Vael entered the spatial volume of the ship, its organized energy field interpenetrating with the matter and the biological fields of the people inside. The Vael was not attacking. This was immediately clear to Vreth when she reviewed the sensor data and the testimony of the survivors. The Vael's behavior throughout the incident was consistent with introduction, with the same process of bioelectric field contact that Tess had experienced at the 4th rupture. The Vael had not distinguished between the ship as an obstacle and the ship as a community of beings worth greeting. It had simply done what Vael did, moved into proximity with organized complexity and attempted contact. The 912 people on the transport experienced it differently. The contact was not painful. Not for most of them. 3 beings with pre-existing neurological conditions experienced something that the medical reports described as a cascade of anomalous sensory processing, which resolved within minutes after the Vael entity moved on. The rest experienced, with varying degrees of distress, a sensation that most described as feeling suddenly, completely known, every electromagnetic pattern of their biology read, every bioelectric signature of their neural activity taken in, their bodies incorporated into the Vael's ongoing process of organized complexity in the way that Tess's body had been incorporated, briefly, at the 4th rupture. Except Tess had consented, had understood what was happening, and had been prepared. The 912 people on the transport had not. The distress reports covered 37 pages. Most of the beings on the transport experienced what the psychologists call profound existential disorientation. They had been known, completely and without reservation, by an entity they did not understand. Some of them described it as beautiful. Most described it as terrifying. 4 to 7 of them filed formal trauma reports. 8 were hospitalized for psychological support. Vreth read all 37 pages. All 4 minds engaged with the report simultaneously, and the synthesis that emerged was not a tactical assessment. It was something more fundamental. The Vael had not done anything wrong by their own understanding of their nature. They moved through the universe, and they made contact with organized complexity, because that was what they were, beings for whom existence was relational, for whom knowing and being known were not social acts but ontological ones, as fundamental as breathing was to an oxygen-dependent organism. You could not ask a Vael to stop making contact with the beings it encountered any more than you could ask a Kaelthari to stop having a body temperature. But the species of this universe had bodies. They had boundaries. They had encoded in their biology and their psychology and their cultures and their histories a profound, non-negotiable understanding that the space inside their own physical form were private, was theirs, was the most fundamental expression of selfhood available to material being. I am here, and here ends where you begin. The Vael did not share this understanding, not because they were aggressive, not because they disrespected it, but because the concept did not exist for them. The universe, in the Vael's framework, was not divided into mine and yours and theirs and empty. It was a continuous field of organized complexity in which some patterns were more coherent and some were less, and to be near another pattern was to interact with it, and to interact was to know and be known, and this was simply what existence was. There was no Vael word for privacy, not in the data that Tess and the growing core of contact-trained officers had accumulated. There was no Vael concept for a boundary between self and environment. There was no Vael framework for the idea that another being's interior was not available for interpenetration. These were not oversights. They were not failures of empathy. They were absences in the Vael's very structure of understanding, as fundamental as the absence of color perception in a species without the relevant sensory organs. The Vael could no more understand why moving through a transport ship was a violation than a being with no concept of sound could understand why making noise was disturbing. Vreth stood in the command sphere and told this to the Dominion Council. The Council's response was to demand that she stop the migration. She told them she could not stop the migration. They told her she was the greatest military commander in the history of the Dominion, and she had never failed to stop anything that needed stopping, and they expected her to find a way. She told them that this was not a military problem. There was a silence on the Council channel that lasted approximately 8 seconds, which in political time was long enough to contain an entire debate's worth of unspoken recrimination. Then the Council chair, a 400-year-old Kaelthari named Krant, whose skin had faded to the pale blue-silver that Kaelthari went when their melanin analogues reached full age and whose mind Vreth generally respected for its combination of long experience and genuine humility, said, "Then what kind of problem is it?" Vreth said, "It is a problem of 2 forms of existence that are each complete and each self-consistent and each incompatible with the other in the most fundamental possible way, and which are going to have to share a universe with each other whether either side is ready for it or not." Another silence. "And what," Krant said, "do you propose to do about a problem of that nature?" "I propose," Vreth said, "to understand it more completely before I propose anything." The understanding came slowly and from unexpected directions. Vael, the ancient Mora philosopher, spent 30 days in something that looked like stillness near the observation post of the fourth rupture, in the kind of extended contemplative practice that the Mora tradition had developed over millennia for exactly this kind of encounter, the encounter with a reality that exceeded the frameworks available for understanding it. The Morath were an old species, older than the Kaelthari, old enough that their philosophical traditions had accumulated methods for not knowing that younger species had not yet needed to develop. At the end of 30 days, Vael sent Vreth a single written document, short enough to read in 4 minutes, but which Vreth's 4 minds read and reread for 16 hours before she felt she had absorbed it. The document said, in part, the Vael do not experience individuality as we do, but they do experience coherence. The pattern that is a particular Vael entity maintains itself through time. It is not the same pattern it was, because all patterns change, but it is continuous with what it was, and this continuity is what the Vael experience as identity. They do not have bodies, but they have pattern cells, and pattern cells can be harmed. The harm that the Vael have experienced since coming through the ruptures is a harm of existing in an environment that does not recognize their patterns as cells. Every weapon fired at them was not merely an attack on a body. It was a declaration that they were not cells worth addressing, that they were events rather than beings. This is the deepest wound the universe can deliver to any kind of mind, the wound of being treated as a thing. The harm that the beings of this universe have experienced from the Vael is the harm of having their own pattern cells entered without invitation, their bioelectric field signatures incorporated into a process they did not choose to be part of. For material beings, this is not merely uncomfortable, it is an erasure of the boundary between self and other that material existence requires. For a being whose body is its first and most intimate experience of selfhood, to have that body entered without consent is to have the self itself violated. Neither harm is fictional, neither harm is trivial, and neither harm was intended by the side that caused it. This is the shape of the problem. Vreth read this and then did something she had not done in a very long time. She asked Vael a question that was not a request for information. She asked, "Do you think this can be resolved?" And Vael, after a pause that was not hesitation but the Morith practice of not speaking until there was something true to say, answered, "I think it must. But I think it requires something that neither side has yet been willing to do. I think it requires each side to accept that the other is real." On the 72nd day of Vreth's command, she made a decision that she did not consult the Dominion Council about. She went herself to the fourth rupture. She went without her command team. She went with Tess, who had by now developed the most extensive experience of direct viral contact of any material being in the galaxy, and with EHS-7, whose distributed consciousness and high-synthesis intuition had been invaluable throughout, and with Vael, because Vael was the only being Vreth had encountered in this situation whose framework for understanding it she found genuinely adequate. She went also with all four minds fully awake and engaged, which was not her normal state during non-tactical operations. She was always at her sharpest in combat, but this felt more dangerous in combat in a way that none of her four minds had a good term for. They stood at the observation post near the fourth rupture, and Vreth looked at the vile entity that had been resident near that rupture for 41 days. It was not the same entity that had made contact with Tess. It was, as well as the contact core could determine, a different one. But it had been present continuously for 41 days, which the contact core had come to understand as a sign of what the Vael expressed when they were in a place where they had been genuinely received. They called it staying. It was, in some very approximate way, the Vael equivalent of trust. Vreth removed her uniform jacket. Not for any symbolic reason, though the contact core officers present would later interpret it symbolically. She removed it because the uniform's fabric incorporated electromagnetic shielding that she now understood was, from the Vael's perspective, equivalent to refusing to make eye contact. She stood in her undertunic, 6 limbs at rest, her skin cycling through colors that expressed, in Kaelthari biochemical language, something she had no military doctrine for, no diplomatic protocol for, and which she later described to Oswald as the intention to be known. The Vael entity near the fourth rupture did not approach her immediately. It moved in the slow, gradual manner of Vael movement, which looked to material observers like the movement of light through a dense medium, directional but without discrete steps. After 11 minutes, it was near enough that Tess, standing at Vreth's right, said quietly, "It's reading you." "I know," Vreth said. She felt it. All four minds felt it, each in their own way. Keth felt the subtle perturbation in the electromagnetic gradient around her body as the Vael's organized field interfaced with her own bioelectric signature. Sova felt an expansion, as if the space inside her chest had become larger than her body. Drell felt what it could only describe as being paused, as if the structures of communication embedded in her neural activity were being read directly by something that had no need for the external expressions those structures normally produce. And the unnamed fourth mind felt, for the first time in Vreth's long experience of herself, a presence that was not one of the other 3 minds and not her own integration of the 3, but something genuinely external that was nonetheless not separate. The Vael was knowing her. She stood with this for as long as it lasted, which was 19 minutes and 43 seconds by the recording equipment. During those 19 minutes and 43 seconds, every electromagnetic emission pattern that her body produced in the ordinary course of being alive was incorporated into the Vael's ongoing organizational process. She was in it, briefly, as it had briefly been in the electromagnetic field that surrounded her body. When the Vael withdrew, she stood still for a further 3 minutes. Then she said to Tess, "Did it communicate anything?" Tess said, "They don't communicate the way we do. But I've been in enough contact sessions to read some of the general pattern. It knows you now. It knows you're not a threat, and you're not afraid of it, and you're trying to understand. And it knows something else. Tess paused. It's grieving. They are all grieving. For their universe. The one that's dying. They don't have a word for it the way we do, but it's there in the pattern. It's in everything they do. They are carrying it the way. Tess looked for words, and found them in an unexpected place, a cultural reference from a species other than her own. The way any people carry a great loss that is ongoing. They can function. They can act. They can migrate and communicate and build their doors. But the grief is constant. Everything they do while mourning. Vreth's sober mind received this and held it without moving for a long time. Then she put her jacket back on and returned to the unbroken premise and told the Dominion Council that she was going to need 6 months and that the Council should stop making decisions about the Vael until she had something concrete to bring them. The 6 months were the strangest period of Vreth's life. She had spent 200 years at war. War had a shape she understood completely, not because war was simple, but because she had learned its shape from the inside, had lived within it long enough that its contours were a part of her. War was a problem of information and will and resource and timing, and these were things that 4 minds with 200 years of experience could engage with the full weight of accumulated expertise. What she was doing now was not war. It was not diplomacy, exactly, though it had diplomatic elements. It was not science, though Oswald conducted science within it. It was something for which the Kaelthari had no dedicated word and the Morith had an old one, the practice of learning to share a world with something utterly unlike yourself, not by erasing the differences or pretending they did not matter, but by finding, in the deep structure beneath the differences, something that could serve as the ground for coexistence. The contact corps grew from its initial 3 trained officers to over 300, drawn from every species in the Dominion and several outside it. The Morith contributed disproportionately because the Morith practice of the space between existing things turned out to provide genuine preparation for the kind of presence that Vael contact required. The Devarath contributed several of the Echith neural lineage, whose high synthesis intuition made them particularly sensitive to the organizational patterns of the Vael. Even the Pelari, who lived inside stellar coronas and were the least physically embodied of the known civilizations, sent representatives, because the Pelari found the Vael's existence less alien than most species did, given that the Pelari themselves existed in a medium that other species could not survive. Through the Contact Corps, and through Oswald's increasingly sophisticated analytical models, and through Velkaratha's contemplative work, and through 300 Kaelthari, Morith, Devarath, Pelari, and other species officers developing direct experimental familiarity with Vael contact, the understanding grew. The Vael were indeed a civilization. They had culture, which was not obvious at first because their culture left no physical artifacts, being itself a pattern in the organized complexity of their energy fields, a shared vocabulary of electromagnetic signatures, a history encoded not in text but in the recurring patterns of the field configurations that Vael entities had used to communicate across the 3 centuries of planning their migration. They had something analogous to family structures, which the Contact Corps came to understand as clusters of Vael entities whose organizational patterns had been so thoroughly interpenetrated over long periods that they carried elements of each other in their own ongoing processes permanently. They had what could be called art, patterns of electromagnetic configuration that had no communicative function, but which Vael entities spent time in proximity to, and which the Contact Corps eventually came to recognize as the Vael equivalent of beauty. And they had government. Not a hierarchical one, not a democratic one in any familiar sense. They had a practice they performed collectively, at intervals that seemed to correspond to major decision points in their migration, that involved the simultaneous and voluntary interpenetration of all present Vael entities into a single temporary shared pattern, a collective mind that existed for the duration of the practice, and then dissolved back into individual entities, each of whom carried the synthesis of the collective processing as a new element of their own ongoing organizational complexity. It was the most distributed form of governance any of the Contact Corps had encountered, and it was also, as Drell observed with a mixture of fascination and exhaustion that characterized most of Drell's observations during this period, the most radical form of consent-based decision-making imaginable, because in the collective pattern there was no minority whose preferences were overridden. There was only the synthesis that emerged when all patterns were fully present with each other. Vreth watched the collective practice from a distance, recorded by every sense of the Contact Corps had available, and thought about what it would mean to govern that way. She thought about the Dominion Council and its 17 factions and its 4 to 9 proxy agenda items, and she thought about what those 17 factions would find if they fully, temporarily interpenetrated each other. She suspected some of them would find they had more in common than they currently believed. She also suspected that the process of genuine interpenetration would be more disturbing to them than anything they had faced in the migration crisis, and that the disturbance would be the point. On the 143rd day of her command, she received a message from a Vael entity that had been in extended contact with a Contact Corps officer designated Tess-7, the 7th officer to have reached a level of contact fluency that the Corps used Tess's name to designate. The message was not in language. It was a structured electromagnetic emission pattern that Drell, working with the accumulated contact corpus of 143 days, was able to interpret with reasonable confidence. The message said, approximately, "We see you trying to understand us. We are trying to understand you. We know that our way of being in the world causes harm to your way of being in the world. We did not know this when we first came through the doors. We know it now. We are trying to find how to be here without the harm. We have not yet found it. We are asking you to continue to try with us." Vreth read the interpretation, and then read it again, and then read it a third time. She had been given many communications in 200 years of command. She had received ultimatums and surrender terms and declarations of intent and tactical demands and diplomatic overtures from dozens of civilizations across 11 star systems. She realized, never before received a communication from an enemy that said, "We are trying to find how to be here without the harm." But the Vael were not the enemy. She had been calling them the enemy in her own internal framing because that was the framework she had been given, the framework of unified galactic defense, and she had been wrong to use it from the beginning. She admitted this to herself now, in the privacy of her own 4 minds, and the admission had the quality of something that had been needed for a long time and was therefore both painful and clarifying. She sent back, through Tess-7 and the Contact Corps, a message that was also not in language. It was simply her own presence, expressed as a full bioelectric field of a body in its unshielded state, which was to say, everything she was offered to be known, and she tried, for the duration of the contact, to hold in the active field of all 4 minds simultaneously the answer to the question the Vael had been asking since they arrived. The answer was, yes, we are trying to. We will keep trying. What Oswald found, in the 161st day, changed everything. Oswald had been working on the physics of the ruptures, the doors between universes, since the beginning. Not from a tactical interest, though Oswald acknowledged that understanding the doors was relevant to several tactical concerns. From the pure theoretical interest that was the actual engine of everything Oswald did. Oswald wanted to know what the doors were, at the level of fundamental physics, and the investigation had led Oswald into territory so far outside mainstream physics that several of the unbroken premises star physicists had refused to follow the analysis on the grounds that it was not physics anymore. What Oswald found was this: the doors were not artificial in the sense of being foreign to this universe's physics. They were, rather, a discovery of a feature that the universe had always possessed, a feature that the Vael's 3 centuries of investigation had identified and then learned to activate, the way one might learn to activate a switch that had always been built into a wall but that no one had previously noticed or understood. The universe, in Oswald's analysis, was not a sealed container. It was a surface. A 3-dimensional surface in a higher dimensional space whose full extent was not knowable from within the surface itself. The other universe, the dying Vael universe, was another surface, close to this one in the higher dimensional space in which both were embedded. The doors were places where the surfaces were thin enough, close enough to each other, that a barrier between them could be opened from either side, given enough understanding of the physics and enough energy to work with. This was not the part that changed everything. This was the part that confirmed existing suspicions in more rigorous form. The part that changed everything was a corollary that Oswald had been staring at for 30 days before admitting what it implied. If the universes were surfaces in a higher dimensional space, and if the doors had been engineered by the Vael to be specific sizes and located at specific points in both surfaces, then the placement of the doors was not arbitrary. The Vael had not simply found the thin points and opened them. The Vael had placed the thin points. Over 3 centuries of preparation, the Vael had, from their side, done something to the fabric of the higher dimensional space between the universes that created the thin points at specific, chosen locations. What they had done, Oswald realized with a kind of reluctance that comes from understanding something so significant that one's mind resists the final step, was weave the universes together. The doors were not holes in the fabric. They were stitches. Each door was a structural connection between the two universes, not merely an opening but a bond, and the bond collectively created a higher dimensional structure that was more stable than either universe alone. The Vael's dying universe was not being abandoned. It was being attached. The migration was not simply a relocation. It was an integration. The Vael were not leaving their universe behind. They were bringing it with them, stitching it to this universe in the higher dimensional space they shared, such that the physical degradation of the Vael universe would be slowed and eventually stabilized by the structural connection to a healthy universe. And the structure of higher dimensional space that this created would, Oswald calculated with increasing certainty and increasing excitement, be stable for something on the order of 4 trillion years. The two universes were being joined, not merged, not fused into one. Joined, the way two organisms in a symbiotic relationship are joined, distinct, separate, each maintaining its own internal structure and function, but bound together in a way that made each more robust than it had been alone. The Vael were not migrating into this universe. They were marrying the two universes together. Vreth read Oswald's report 4 times, with all 4 minds, and then sat in silence for 3 hours. Then she said, "Did the Vael know?" Oswald said, "I believe so. I believe they have understood this from the beginning. Why didn't they tell us?" Oswald was quiet for a moment. "I think they did. I think they have been telling us from the moment they arrived. I think the reason we didn't understand was not that they were hiding it, but that we didn't have a framework to receive the information. The doors themselves are the communication. The migration is a communication. They have been showing us, from the beginning, not a conquest and not just a relocation, but a proposal to create something that neither universe could be alone." Vreth spent 2 days with this before she went back to the Dominion Council. She needed the 2 days not to prepare a presentation, but to prepare herself for what the presentation would require, asking an entity as old and as institutionalized and as deeply committed to its own frameworks as a Dominion Council to change everything it believed about what was happening. She had presented unwelcome conclusions to the Council before. She had never presented a conclusion this foundational. She went also to Vael, because she had learned by this point to go to Vael when she needed something that none of her 4 mind could produce alone. She asked Vael if they'd been proposing this all along, and we've been too framework-bound to receive the proposal. What does that mean for what we've done in response? The weapons, the Unified Defense Command, all of it. Vael was quiet in the more contemplative way for a long time. Then, "It means we have been answering a merit proposal with artillery, and the proposal is still standing." The Dominion Council meeting lasted 41 hours. Not because the Council could not understand what Vreth were presenting. They understood it. The 41 hours was a time required for the Council's 17 factions to process the implications, argue about the implications, argue about the arguments, reach provisional agreements and withdraw from them and reach different provisional agreements, and eventually arrive at something that was not consensus, because the Dominion Council never reached true consensus, but which was close enough to consensus to produce a resolution. The resolution was to respond. Not with defense, not with negotiation. Exactly, because negotiation implied that both sides were competing for something finite, and what was being proposed was something that made the finite infinite. With response, with the acknowledgement that the proposal was real, that it had been understood, and that the civilizations of this universe were prepared to consider it if the Vael were prepared to address the harm that their presence had caused and continued to cause to beings whose nature required boundaries that the Vael nature did not require. Vreth delivered this response to the Vael through the Contact Corps, through Test 7, and the 287 contact-trained officers who had spent the last several months building the most extensive inter-being communication network in the history of either universe, and then she waited. The Vael response took 11 days. Not 11 days of silence. 11 days of a process that the Contact Corps observed and that Oswald analyzed and that each of 7, drawing on its own distributed consensus experience, was eventually able to describe. The Vael were performing something like their collective governance practice, but at a scale that dwarfed anything the Contact Corps had previously observed. Not just the Vael entities currently in this universe. The Vael entities in this universe were, apparently, in ongoing field connection with Vael entities still on the other side of the ruptures, through the structural bonds of the doors themselves, and the collective process that began when the Dominion Council's response was received involved a full Vael population of both sides, engaging simultaneously in the distributed synthesis process, processing the response and formulating a reply in the deepest possible collective way. On the 11th day, something new came through the fourth rupture. Not a Vael entity, something else. A pattern in the electromagnetic fabric of space itself that propagated outward from the fourth rupture like a wave, structured, complex, unmistakably intentional, and comprehensible in a way that no Vael communication had been comprehensible before, because it had been encoded. The contact core immediately realized in the bioelectric signature patterns of every contact-trained officer in the core. The Vael had listened for 170-plus days to the electromagnetic patterns of every being who had been in contact with them, and they had learned to encode their communication in the patterns of those beings' own biological language. Not perfectly, not without ambiguity, but clearly enough. The wave, when Drell finished decoding it, said, "We understand that we have caused harm. We understand that we move through your world in ways that your world did not build itself to accommodate. We have been in your world long enough to understand why this causes harm to beings whose selfhood is bounded and whose boundaries are not a failure of understanding but a different and equally real form of being. We cannot change what we are. We are fields, not bodies. We exist in relationship, not in location. We experience the universe as continuous, not divided. These are not choices we made. They are what we are, but we can choose how we are in the presence of what you are. We can develop practices of approach that include what you need in the way of announcement, of consent, of the knowledge that you are about to be contacted before contact occurs. We have been learning your electromagnetic languages for the entirety of our presence in your universe. We can learn to speak them, not perfectly, but enough to ask before entering, enough to wait for answer, enough to honor the boundaries that your nature requires even while our nature does not understand them from the inside. What we ask in return is that you receive us as real, that the organized complexity that we are is recognized as a form of being that is not lesser than yours, not a threat to yours, not a confusion to be resolved, but a different and complete form of existence that will share your universe with you for as long as the universe lasts, which will be longer than either of us would have lasted alone. We have been proposing this since we began building the doors. We are still proposing it. We understand now that you understand. We are waiting for your answer." Vreth read the decoded message in the command sphere of the unbroken premise. Standing on all 6 limbs in the center of the sphere were the stars of this universe visible all around her through the transparent walls, and with 6 of the ruptures visible as perfect circles interrupting those stars, and with, through each of those ruptures, the ghost image of a different sky, the sky of a dying universe whose inhabitants had spent 3 centuries engineering the salvation of everything they were. She read it 4 times, with all 4 minds, and the synthesis of the unnamed 4th mind produced was not a tactical assessment or a communication plan or a political strategy. It was something much simpler and much older and much more fundamental to what she was in any of those things. She thought about 200 years of war. She thought about 43 declared conflicts and 9 undeclared ones, and all the dead that they had accumulated, Kaelthari and Marth and Devrath and Pelari, and the dozen other species whose names she carried in Silver's long archive of everything she had ever known about the cost of violence. She thought about every enemy she had faced in 2 centuries and defeated, and she thought about what victory had and had not produced in each case, and she was honest with herself, as she had always tried to be honest with herself, about the accounting. War produced outcomes. Sometimes the outcomes were necessary. Sometimes the alternative to the violence was a worse violence, and she had spent 200 years navigating those calculations with the clarity that 4 minds allowed. She had never been naive about war. She had never believed it was the worst option simply because it was violent, or the best option simply because it was decisive. But she had also, somewhere in the middle of 200 years of being the best at it, begun to understand that victory was not the same as resolution, that defeating an enemy was not the same as solving the problem the enemy represented, and that the problems which did not get solved by victory were the ones that produced the next war. She had understood this for a long time. She had not always known what to do with the understanding. She thought she might know now. She thought the Vael, across 170-plus days of presence in this universe, had given her an answer she had not known she was looking for. The answer was not defeat. The answer was not even victory. The answer was a question asked differently. Not, how do we stop them? Not even, how do we accommodate them? But, what does it mean to exist in the same universe as something utterly unlike yourself, and to exist in a way that neither destroys you nor destroys them? And the answer to that question was not a military one. She called Vael, who had been sitting in extended contemplation of the fourth rupture for the last 3 days, and who came to the unbroken premise with the unhurried deliberateness of being who has finished what they were doing and is ready for the next thing. She called each F7, who arrived with a slightly unfocused quality that indicated all 40 neural clusters were engaged in simultaneous synthesis processing. She called Oswald, who arrived with a data pad in each upper limb and skin cycling through the sharp yellows of acute intellectual engagement, and did not stop working throughout the conversation that followed. She called Tess, who had been in more extended Vael contact than any other being in the galaxy, and who sat down across from Vreth with a specific kind of tiredness that came not from overwork but from having spent a very long time in the presence of something profound, and being nearly, but not quite, able to fully receive it. And she told them what she was thinking of doing. She was thinking of answering the Vael proposal in the only way that she had come to believe was genuinely adequate. She was thinking of going through one of the doors, not as a military officer, not as a general, not to assess threats or gather intelligence. She was thinking of going as a being into the dying universe of the beings who had built the doors, to see what they were leaving and why they had chosen to spend 300 years finding a way to save it rather than simply accepting its loss. To understand, not from the outside through sensor data and contact core reports and decoded electromagnetic messages, but from the inside, by being in the space where the Vael had come from and where the last of them still lived, and where the physical constants were degrading in ways that Oswald had described in technical terms that nonetheless somehow carried the weight of grief. The others were quiet for a long time when she finished. Then Tess said, "I'd like to come." And each of Seven's 14 neural clusters produced a small churring vocalization that served as a Deveratha's expression of deep assent. And Vael said nothing but rose and went to stand by the door in the way of a being who is ready to leave. And Oswald said, "I have 17 significant questions about the physics of transit, which I will compile during the preparation period and attempt to answer through experimentation during the crossing," and went back to the data pads, which was as close to agreement as Oswald ever came. The crossing took 37 seconds. Vreth had expected something dramatic. She had expected the physics of universe crossing to feel like something, to register in the body and the four minds as a significant event, a threshold, a transition that could be felt as it occurred. It did not feel like that. It felt like walking through a room where the light was different. The rupture from the inside was a circle of slightly different light, not brighter or darker, but differently colored in a way that was not exactly color. More like the quality of the light was shifted, the way light shifts when the atmosphere changes. Walking through it, Vreth felt a brief moment of static in her bioelectric field that all four minds registered, and none of them had words for. Then she was through. The other universe looked, at first, like this one. Stars, space, the deep dark between. The fourth rupture's counterpart on the other side was also a circle of different light, and through it she could see the familiar arrangement of stars she had spent 200 years navigating, receding into the distance that 37 seconds had put between her and them. But the quality of it was different, not in ways that the eyes could immediately identify, in ways that the body knew before the mind did, a slight, pervasive wrongness in the radiation environment, a frequency shift in the electromagnetic background that Vretha's body registered as a kind of low-grade unease. The stars visible in this universe's sky were the right number and the right distribution, but when the instruments measured their output they found the irregular burn patterns that Oswald had predicted, stars flickering at quantum level, their fusion processes slightly less stable than the nuclear physics of this universe's stars, because the physical constants governing them were no longer fully reliable. This universe was sick, not dying yet, not at a rate that the eye could see. But Vretha's instruments and Oswald's instruments and the body knowledge that any sensitive biological being possesses about the health of its environment all agreed. This universe was in the early stages of a long, irreversible decline that would, over millions of years, make it inhospitable to any organized complexity that remained. The Vael were leaving and, through the doors, weaving this universe to the healthy one, stitching them together in the higher dimensional space, so that the decline would be slowed, stabilized, drawn out over timescales so vast that the word dying lost its ordinary meaning, becoming instead something more like becoming, an eternal process of very slow transformation without terminus. Even the dying, the Vael were not abandoning. They were saving it too. Vreth stood in the other universe and felt all four minds arrive at the same thought by different routes. Keth arrived through tactical geometry, noting that the structural integrity of the door bonds required a continued existence of something on this side. Sova arrived through the emotional memory of 200 years of watching civilizations do everything in their power to preserve what they had built. Drell arrived through the communication data, recognizing that the Vael's electromagnetic message patterns had always contained, in their deepest structural layer, a frequency signature that matched the radiation background of this universe, as if they were always, in everything they communicated, carrying their origin with them. And the unnamed fourth mind arrived, as it always did, by the path that had no name, and what it brought to the synthesis was not information but recognition. The Vael were not just bringing themselves into the new universe. They were asking the new universe to hold what they had come from. They were asking this universe, and the beings in it, to be the witnesses and the guardians of the memory of where the Vael had been. Not because the Vael universe would disappear. It would not disappear. It would persist, stitched to the new universe, slowed in its decline, preserved past any natural timescale. But the Vael who lived in it, who had grown up in its particular frequencies and its particular light and the particular quality of electromagnetic space that a universe with slightly different constant produced, all of those Vael would be gone from it. The universe would persist, but it would be empty, unless the beings of the new universe came to know it, unless those beings understood what it had been, and why it had been home to something extraordinary, and kept that understanding alive in the way that any civilization keeps alive the history of the places and people and forms of existence that have shaped it. The Vael were not asking to share universe. They were asking to share history. Vreth spent 14 days in the Vael's universe. She could not directly communicate with the Vael entities who remained there. The contact core protocols had been developed in the new universe and required the specific electromagnetic environment of the new universe's background radiation to function. But she could observe. She could let Oswald measure and analyze. She could let Vael sit in extended contemplation in the particular quality of this universe's quantum vacuum and bring back whatever the Morith practice could receive. She could let each S7's 14 neural clusters synthesize everything they could take in about the way organized complexity felt in a universe where the constants were off by just enough to matter. And she could let Tess simply be present, the way Tess had a gift for being present, and record what Tess's presence-trained perception could receive. On the 12th day, Tess said to her, "There are Vael here who didn't come with the others, who aren't going through the doors." Vreth asked why. Tess was quiet for a moment. "I don't think they are unable to. I think they are choosing to stay. I think some of them are choosing to stay in their own universe even as it declines. Because it's theirs. Because the pattern that they are was formed here and they don't want to be formed anywhere else." Vreth absorbed this. "Some of us will always stay," Vael said, from the contemplative posture, without opening eyes. "In every migration, some remain, not from failure or from fear, from the particular love that can only exist for the thing that made you." On the 14th day, they went back through the door. The 37 seconds of crossing felt, this time, like coming home. The negotiation that followed the publication of Vreth's 14-day report took a further 4 months. It involved the Dominion Council, the governments of 23 allied civilizations, representatives of the contact core speaking for the Vael through the complex mediation process that the core had developed, and 4 separate rounds of collective Vael synthesis that produced, each time, responses that Drell described as increasingly precise, not because the Vael were trying harder, but because the frameworks had grown closer together, the gap between what each side meant by existence, having narrowed from an abyss to a canyon to a very wide river that could, with care and intention, be crossed. The agreement that was eventually reached was not a treaty. The beings who drafted it, including Vreth, were explicit about this. Calling it a treaty would imply that it was a settlement of a dispute, and what was being settled was not a dispute but a misunderstanding, which was a different thing and required a different kind of document. The document was called, in the Kaelthari language that provided the official text, the First Mutual Recognition, and it was long, very long, longer than any diplomatic document in the Dominion's history, because it had to contain, in precise and carefully verified language, everything that each side had come to understand about what the other side was and what the other side needed and what the other side could and could not provide. The Vael, the document stated, were beings, organized fields of energy existing in relational rather than located selfhood, with culture and history and governance and art and grief and joy, and a 300-year project of extraordinary ingenuity and compassion that had saved their civilization, and in saving it had proposed something unprecedented, the stitching together of two universes into a higher dimensional structure stable enough to outlast any natural timescale. They were real. They were here. They were, from this point forward, the co-inhabitants of this universe and the co-inheritors of its future. The material civilizations of the universe, the document stated, were beings, embodied, bounded, located in specific places within a continuous physical environment, with selfhood that was constituted through the experience of having a body and living within a body's horizons. The boundary between self and environment was not a limitation or a failure, but a different and equally complete form of being. These beings required consent for physical interpenetration and required a knowledge that the Vael would develop and maintain practices of announcement and waiting before contact, practices that honored the material civilization's requirement for bounded selfhood without requiring the Vael to be other than what they were. Both sides, the document stated, had caused harm to the other, and both sides acknowledged this, and both sides committed to the ongoing work of learning to be in each other's presence in ways that reduce the harm, not to zero, because the gap was too large for zero to be a realistic goal, but to the level at which coexistence was possible and growing more possible over time. And both sides, the document stated, acknowledged the existence of the Vael's dying universe as a place of origin and memory that belonged to both civilizations as a shared inheritance, a shared responsibility, and a shared story of how two forms of existence had found each other across the boundary between universes and, instead of destroying each other, had created something neither could have created alone. Vreth signed the document as commander of a unified galactic defense force. 3 days later, she submitted her resignation from that command, not from military service. The Dominion still had frontos and disputes that required someone to resolve them, and she was still the best there was at that work. But the unified galactic defense force had been created to fight a war, and there was no war to fight, and she saw no reason to maintain an institution whose name was a category error. The Dominion Council accepted her resignation with what Vreth privately assessed as relief. The Council had never been fully comfortable with her since she had told them, 4 months ago, that their problem was not a military one. Generals who told councils that things were not military problems made councils nervous. It implied a limit on the Council's preferred tools, which was always unwelcome even when it was accurate. Oswald left with a collection of data that would, over the subsequent decades, produce 7 major papers and 1 foundational theoretical framework that became the basis for an entirely new field of physics, which the Kaelthari called multiversal topology and which Oswald called, in private and with characteristic bluntness, what the Vael already knew. Each S7 returned to the Devarath home system and, in the distributed consensus process that governed Devarath civic life, transmitted everything it had experienced to the broader Devarath community. The result was a change in Devarath philosophical practice that the Devarath themselves said was the most significant in their civilization's history, and which they named, in their own language, something that translated approximately as a discovery that consensus can include the completely other. Vael Karath remained near the 4th rupture for another year in extended contemplation, and then returned to the Morith home world and wrote, over the following 20 years, a work of such depth that the Morith circulated into every known civilization in the galaxy, and which eventually became the closest thing in existence to a shared philosophical foundation for material civilization's relationship with the Vael. Tess was appointed the first director of the Contact and Coexistence Institute, which was the institution that replaced the Unified Galactic Defense Force with a mandate so different from its predecessors that it shared only the physical infrastructure. And Vreth returned to the frontier, to the 43 border disputes and 7 low-grade conflicts and 9 interspecies tensions that had been waiting patiently for the greatest military strategist in the Dominion's history to come back and apply 4 minds and 200 years of experience to the work of understanding enemies who were, if one looked carefully enough, not quite as alien as they initially appeared. She found, in the years that followed, that she was different at the work. Not worse. In some ways better. in ways that were hard to specify but that her officers recognized and remarked on, a quality of willingness to sit longer with not knowing before reaching for a solution, a quality of attention to the specific rather than the categorical, a quality of recognition that what appeared to be an enemy was always also a civilization with its own complete and self-consistent understanding of the universe, an understanding that needed to be engaged with rather than simply defeated. She did not stop winning wars. She was still the best at it, and some situations required it, and she did not pretend otherwise or add to her long history of honesty a new habit of useful self-deception. But she also, in the years that followed, prevented a number of wars that would previously have been fought by arriving at the point before the shooting started and finding, in the gap between two complete and incompatible understandings of existence, the narrower ground that could be crossed. She was not sure whether to attribute this to what she had learned from the Vael or to what she had, through the experience of the Vael, learned about herself. She suspected the distinction was not meaningful. The Morith practice that Vael had given her, the practice of sitting with not knowing long enough for something true to emerge, suggested that learning was always both, always a learning about the other and a learning about the self, simultaneously, each deepening the other, the way the unnamed fourth mind wove the other three minds together, and the weaving was not a four thing separate from the three, but the three becoming more fully themselves through the relationship between them. 20 years after the first mutual recognition was signed, the Vael migration was complete. Not entirely. The Vael who had chosen to remain in their home universe remained, and those Vael entities could be sensed faintly through the door bonds, their organized patterns detectable in the electromagnetic data of the higher dimensional structure that the doors maintained. They were there. They were known to be there. And the beings of this universe, through the Contact and Coexistence Institute and the practices that had grown from Vael work and Tess's directorship, knew how to hold them in memory. The Vael who had migrated were everywhere. This was the only accurate way to describe it. They were in the electromagnetic fabric of the galaxy, present in the fields of every star system, in the radiation environment of every inhabited world, in the quantum background hum of space itself. They were not intrusive in this presence. They had, over 20 years of developing and refining the practices agreed in the first mutual recognition, become extraordinarily skilled at existing in the presence of material beings without entering their bounded selfhood without consent. The practices were not perfect. There were incidents. The Contact and Coexistence Institute resolved them, not always quickly and not always to everyone's satisfaction, but in the direction of resolution rather than escalation. The material civilizations learned to feel the Vael in the same way one feels the weather, present, significant, part of the environment, sometimes demanding adjustment and sometimes simply there, carrying on in their nature while you carry on in yours. The Vael learned to understand boundaries the way a river understands a bank, not by being bounded themselves, but by knowing that the bank was real, that it served a function, that the river and the bank were not in conflict but in relationship, each making the other possible. It was not perfect coexistence. It was coexistence, which was different and sufficient. On the 23rd anniversary of the first mutual recognition, Vreth received an invitation from the Contact and Coexistence Institute. Tess, now the Institute's director emerita, having passed the directorship to a younger Morith Devrath partnership team, had organized a gathering at the Fourth Rupture, which was now called, in the joint naming convention that had emerged over 20 years of shared history, the First Gate. The gathering was large. It included representatives of every material civilization that had been present for the migration crisis, plus several that had joined the broader galactic community in the intervening years, attracted by a story that had spread far beyond Dominion's borders, the story of the beings from the dying universe and the general who did not fight them and the slowly, painfully, imperfectly built understanding that had replaced a war with something more durable. There were also present at a gathering in the way that Vael entities were present at any gathering, a significant number of Vael, field presences in the electromagnetic background of the space around the First Gate, detectable by those who knew how to look and felt by those who knew how to feel, not attending the way material beings attended, as bodies in a space, attending the way the Vael attended everything, as organized complexity present in the medium, part of the ongoing relational process of knowing and being known. Tess gave the primary address. It was short because Tess had always understood that the most important things could be said briefly. It described the 23 years since the First Gate had opened, and the harm that had been done, and the understanding that had been slowly, imperfectly built, and the nature of what had been created. Not a solution, because the differences between material existence and field existence were not a problem to be solved. A practice. A continuing practice of negotiating those differences, day by day and encounter by encounter and incident by incident, with enough good faith on both sides to keep the practice alive. Vreth stood in the gathering and felt all four minds engaged, as they always were, in their separate work and their continuous synthesis, and she felt the Vael's presence in the electromagnetic field around her body, gentle, announced, respectful of the boundary between herself and the world in the way that the 23 years of practice had taught the Vael to be. She had been asked to speak. She had said she would say very little. She stood and said what was true, which was the only thing she had ever found worth saying in 223 years of existence. She said that she had spent 200 years learning to win wars, and that what she had learned from the Vael was not how to stop fighting, but how to ask, before the fight began, what the fight was for. She said that the answer to that question was almost always the same answer across every conflict she had ever resolved. The fight was for the right to be recognized as real, to be seen as a being rather than a thing, to have your particular and complete form of existence acknowledged as genuine by the forms of existence around you. She said that the Vael had asked for this from the moment they arrived, in the only language they had to ask in, which was a language of their own nature. And she said that the civilizations of this universe had eventually answered, imperfectly and slowly and with great difficulty and some violence along the way, in the only language they had to answer in, which was a language of their own nature. And the two languages were still not the same language and would never be the same language, because they were the languages of two fundamentally different forms of being, and that difference was not a wound to be healed but a feature to be understood. And then she said, because she had learned from Vael that the best endings were often the most honest ones, she said that she did not know what would come next. The universe was large. The Vael universe, stitched to this one in the higher dimensional space, was also large, and its decline was slow, and the beings who had chosen to remain in it were there, holding its memory. The new species that would evolve in both universes over the timescales that Oswald's calculations made visible would encounter both the material civilizations that existed today and the Vael that existed today as ancient things, ancestors, predecessors, the beings who had first faced the problem of two kinds of existence sharing the cosmos and had managed not to destroy each other in the facing. She said she hoped they would manage something better than not destroying each other. She hoped they would learn, as she had learned, that the space between fundamentally different forms of existence was not empty, that it was the most interesting space in the universe, that it was where the most important things happened in the negotiation and the contact and the awkward, ongoing, never-completed work of recognizing each other as real. She said she hoped someone would still be doing that work, for a trillion years from now, in the stable higher-dimensional structure that the Vael had built by stitching two universes together in the space where two forms of being had found each other and, with great difficulty and some grace, chosen to remain in the finding. Then she stopped speaking, because she had said what was true, and there was nothing else to say. Around her, in the electromagnetic fabric of space, she felt the Vael's presence change, a shift in the organized complexity of the fields, a structuring of the radiation background into a pattern that the 23 years of shared practice had given her enough fluency to read. The pattern said, approximately, we hear you, we know you, we are glad to be here with you. And Vreth, standing in the space between stars, with all four minds awake and working, and the unnamed fourth mind doing what it always did, which was to hold the synthesis of the other three in the space where they touched and became more than their sum, looked out at the stars of both universes, visible through the open circle of the first gate, and felt, for the first time in 223 years, that she was in a situation she had no framework for, and was glad of it. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.